The approaches to Halifax Harbour have long been a mariner's nightmare. This coastline is littered with shipwrecks, and the land from Portuguese Cove through Chebucto Head and on to Duncan's Cove has never been an easy place for settlement. But these days, it's the Duncan's Cove Nature Reserve, and it's a great place for hiking. And that coastline has turned from a mariner's nightmare into a scuba diver's paradise. Today I'm hiking from Portuguese Cove all the way to Chebucto Head, past the Chebucto Head Lighthouse. It's not a long distance, only a few kilometers, but it's one which can take a while as you navigate rocky ledges and cliffs and scrub brush. Online you may find it called the Portuguese Cove Lighthouse Trail, but the lighthouse is actually at Chebucto Head. I can see it in the distance already along my hike, making it feel closer than it is, because the straight line distance will be much different for me than the hiking route. There are a number of ways that you can do this hike. You can go out and back from Chebucto Head, or as I've done, you can actually leave from Portuguese Cove and make your way across the Barren to Chebucto Head. If you leave from Portuguese Cove, there's a publicly owned trailhead on the mostly private Letitia Lane. It's hard to know exactly how Portuguese Cove got its name. It may very well have been the result of a Portuguese crew being shipwrecked in the cove. So many ships met their end there. In 1953, the paddle wheel ocean liner Humboldt grounded in Portuguese Cove. This after having struck rocks off Sambro Island under the direction of a fisherman pretending to be a pilot for extra money. After striking the rocks, the crew managed to get the ship turned around towards Halifax, but not long after grounded in Portuguese Cove where the ship was torn apart by the waves. Over 300,000 pounds sterling of cargo, including coins, jewelry, and gold watches, were scattered on the harbor bottom. And because the wreck was so thoroughly destroyed by the waves, occasionally divers still find pieces of treasure. Sambro Island isn't all that close to here, and these days you would just go into the port of Sambro. But it's sometimes easy to forget just how isolated some of these small fishing ports would be, and so it made sense for crews to want to try and get into Halifax to get repairs and provisions if they wrecked on one of the ledges out there. Now, about a century before the Humboldt went down in 1813, the Adelante also had an accident off of Sambro Island and made its way into Portuguese Cove. Now, Portuguese Cove, they managed to get all of the crew, which is 79 men and 1 woman, to shore where the villagers fed them and got them warm before they then had to march into the town of Halifax. My entire hike today is across the Duncan's Cove Nature Reserve, which is a 911-acre coastal headland recognized for the bogs and barrens. It is the only location in Nova Scotia where the rare Arctic blueberry is said to grow. Duncan's Cove, the village, and the actual cove is just around the point from where I will end my hike. It was first settled by Europeans in 1752, and the cove and this nature reserve were named for Admiral Adam Duncan, the first Viscount Duncan, who defeated the Dutch at the Battle of Camperdown. Now, interestingly, this hike is bookended by connections to Viscount Duncan. At the one end is the village and the town, and just before the start of my hike is the former site of the Camperdown signal station, an important part of Fortress Halifax from the late 1700s, and now recognized by a street of the same name around the area where the station once stood. You may remember I started this hike on a trailhead on Letitia Lane. Now, Letitia was the name of an ocean liner that used to sail between Glasgow and Quebec. When World War I came in 1914, it was requisitioned as a hospital ship working mostly in the Mediterranean. And on August 1st, 1917, it ran aground right here on these rocks. It was lost in all of 10 minutes. 546 wounded Canadian soldiers were aboard at the time. Now, thankfully, all of them were saved. And this happened because of heavy fog coming into the harbor. Naval ships raced to the rescue, and while all of the soldiers survived, one crew member was forgotten aboard and died while trying to swim to safety. Over the years, looters have removed most of the equipment, but it remains a popular dive site, split into two, with one part of the ship having slid into deeper water. You get up high on this barren and you really start to notice the wind sometimes. Hikers over the years have collected debris from all along the shore and mixed it with rocks and built this cairn. And occasionally they come up and they will replace this flag. And had I known it was in such bad shape, I would have brought a flag myself, but I don't have one with me. I'm sure it'll be replaced fairly soon. You know, looking down on these waters, it's amazing to think of all the shipwrecks that are there. Right next to the Letitia is the wreck of the Cape Anguillus. Now that was a 138-foot steam trawler that went down in 1956, and it went down because it couldn't find its position in heavy fog. And so many of the ships that ended up on the bottom of the harbor were because of heavy fog. And that's why the Chebucto Lighthouse, which is just ahead, is so important. This area is known as the Gulch, and it's a really popular place to watch wildlife. There's not a lot going on in there today. It's a calm day, but birds will often nest in here or try to get in here away from some of the ocean currents. You can see seals playing in here at different times. They'll come right up on the beach. Today, I'm lucky because the beach is actually just covered in rocks, but sometimes it is absolutely full of 1 or 2 foot deep seaweed that you have to wade yourself through in order to get to the other side. You know, this is a spot you can sit on a nice day, or even if it's really windy, and just enjoy the ocean and all that it has to offer. I'm going to continue on here towards Chebucto Head Lighthouse. Now, you can imagine with all the wrecks that have occurred along this coastline, just how important a lighthouse would be. That's after the break. I'm at the Duncan's Cove Nature Reserve, and I'm on my way to the Chebucto Head Lighthouse. Now, there have been a number of lighthouses and other buildings on the site over the years. The first one was built in 1872 for the princely sum of $2,400. There was an additional $1,400 added for lighting. Edwin Johnson was the first lighthouse keeper here, and he earned the sum of $400 a year for his efforts. It wasn't long before it was clear that the lighthouse needed a foghorn. In 1890, dynamite was used to blast the cliffs to build a fog alarm building and a reservoir to hold the 117,000 gallons of water used for the steam to run the alarm. The first whistle blew on June 1st, 1892. By 1906, the fog alarm system was supplemented with an underwater bell that could be heard by vessels with a special listening device called a sonar. By 1930, there was a need for a new lighthouse here, and an octagonal one was built along with 2 homes for lighthouse keepers at a cost of $17,000. They didn't last very long though. In 1940, the military took over this site as World War II had come about, and they took down that lighthouse and replaced it with searchlights, gun emplacements, and directors' towers. The current lighthouse was constructed in 1967. At around the same time, Halifax Harbour Traffic's Control Centre opened from here, though those operations moved to Bedford Basin in the 1980s. In 1983, the Government of Canada started taking down the old buildings on this site. But the Chebucto Head Lighthouse Society was formed because they wanted to preserve what was here. They had a vision for telling the history of this site. By 2003, they were able to reach an agreement with the Government of Canada where they would lease one of the remaining buildings, that building being a former lighthouse keeper's home, to use as a museum and community center of sorts to tell the story of Chebucto Head. Unfortunately, in 2004, just 9 days after they had their ribbon cutting and opening, the house burned to the ground. All that's left now is bits of foundation and gravel where that house once stood. The dream of having a museum here was over. The lighthouse, of course, still operates, as does the fog alarm, but all of that is automated now. There's a lovely story that goes back to the people who lived here in 1929, the lighthouse keepers. Edward and Catherine Gallagher. Well, Edward was the lighthouse keeper, and Catherine had traveled the world. She had become a teacher, but was too young to teach. She had gone to New York, where she worked as a chef. But what was most interesting is she had actually learned folk songs from her mother, and she would spend her time here singing them. Well, over the years, Dr. Helen Creighton, yes, that Dr. Helen Creighton, who's so well known in Nova Scotia for collecting folk songs, heard tell of Catherine and came out to Shipwrecks Light to visit her and record some of those songs. Well, those recordings made Catherine sort of Halifax, if you will, maybe even a little bit international famous, because she started performing on radio shows and even doing concerts. To this day, if you go to the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C., you can find some of the recordings of Catherine singing those folk songs here at Shipwrecks Lighthouse. The name Shipwrecks comes from the Mi'kmaq word Jibugtuk, which translates to the biggest harbor. And this point in the biggest harbor was always important for navigation, for transportation, for commercial shipping, and also the military. Even beyond the threats of wartime, Shipwrecks Head and the approaches to Halifax Harbour were difficult to navigate at the best of times, especially in heavy fog. And that was true even after there were lighthouses here. You know, there are a number of wrecks along these shores, and if you look out over the water here, you will see, you know, it's almost high tide, but you can still see some of the rocks that are coming above the water. Now you imagine trying to navigate that in heavy fog at full high tide, not being able to see some of these shoals, maybe not sure how far from land you are. That's why there's so many wrecks here. And there are two in particular down this end of Shipwrecks Head and this park that are very popular with scuba divers, the Islesworth and the A.W. Perry. The Islesworth went down in 1912 and the A.W. Perry went down in 1915. The Islesworth was a 120-meter steamship traveling from Boston to Lewisburg. It ran into propeller trouble and turned into Halifax for assistance. But like so many other wrecks, it found itself lost in that heavy fog, slamming into the rocks at the base of this cliff. Lying very close to the Islesworth is the A.W. Perry. It was coming into Halifax in heavy fog, like so many other ships. And the crew tried to convince the captain that he should use other navigation aids. They said, "Captain, there have been so many wrecks there, please use something else." But the captain said no, he was only going to use his magnetic compass. And of course, the magnetic compass on a ship made of steel carrying a cargo of iron ore did not work. And the ship was wrecked and now lies at the bottom here of the Halifax Harbour approaches. Fortunately, all 130 crew and the 45 passengers aboard made it to shore safely. There was an inquiry, and the inquiry found that the captain, Captain Alfred Ellis, was at fault, and he lost his master's certificate for 6 months. If you were to draw a line from Shipwrecks Head all the way across the water to the other side, you would mark the geographic end of Halifax Harbour. Now, the legal end is actually much further in towards the city. But this is the spot where during World War II, the Canadian military decided to protect Halifax and protect Canada. And that's why you see the military installations up and down this coast, including the gun battery behind me. And that gun battery was there to protect from surface vessel attacks and U-boat attacks. But it wasn't always successful. On April 16th, 1945, German U-boat U-190 sunk the HMCS Esquimalt. And that became the very last Canadian warship to be sunk during World War II. It happened just weeks before the May 7th end of the European campaign in that war. And of course, Fortress Halifax not only included installations here, but includes installations that go all the way into the city and has done for hundreds of years. And the granite for some of those, such as York Redoubt and the Halifax Citadel, comes from a quarry somewhat further in towards the city. And that's where I'm going after the break.
Won't you be mine? Feel the sunshine.
If you work your way back towards Purcell's Cove from Chebucto Head, you'll reach the Queen's Quarry and Captain Arnell trails. They head off into the Purcell's Cove backlands, where there was not just one, but at least 4 quarries that supplied granite to many of Halifax's most prominent buildings, and is where I'm on my walkabout today. The route into the quarry area starts on a trail called the Captain Arnell Trail. Arnell was a sea captain who lived in Bermuda. His wife, who was from Halifax, and Arnell purchased land in the Purcell's Cove area as a cottage residence in the 1920s to escape the southern heat. Captain Arnell's grandchildren donated the 12 hectares of family land around Purcell's Pond, which I'll reach at about the halfway point on this hike, and so the first portion of this trail is named for him. This land was protected because of the hard work of the Nova Scotia Nature Trust. Where I'm crossing at the moment is the Captain Arnell conservation lands and the Napier conservation lands, and I'll be going into other protected areas later in this hike that are not directly associated with the Nova Scotia Nature Trust. This hike goes up and down, but ultimately is a route going uphill to an area that will overlook the Northwest Arm. This small stream runs from Purcell's Pond, which I'm getting close to, all the way down to Purcell's Cove itself. It seems to have originally been called Mackerel Cove by the Mi'kmaq before going through at least one name change, and then in 1828 being renamed Purcell's Cove after Samuel Purcell, who purchased 300 acres of land by what is now Spectacle Island for £200 sterling. This look off over Purcell's Pond more or less marks the end of the Captain Arnell Trail. The trail, of course, continues, but now it continues on with the name the Queen's Quarry Trail, and the Queen's Quarry is where I'm headed. Sometime in the late 1700s, a man by the name of John Trider was given a 200-acre quarry parcel right in this area, and it was for ironstone and granite. Now, that stone was really good. In 1790, it was used to construct the Prince of Wales Martello Tower that you now find in Point Pleasant Park, and in 1815, Sherbrooke Tower on McNabb's Island. Now, you know what happens in those days when something is really good? Well, the Crown decides that they need to own it. And so it was in 1828, the Royal Engineers came and took over the quarry for the expansion of Halifax Citadel. What the government did was deed the property over to 3 individuals: Gustavus Nichols, a colonel in the British Army and commander of the engineers; Charles Morris, the very well-known surveyor general for the province and for whom Morris Street in Halifax is named; and St. Rupert de George, the secretary of the province of Nova Scotia. From that point on, it became known as the Queen's Quarry. Now, this is an interesting name for the time because there was no Queen of England in 1828. King George IV was sitting on the throne, and his last wife, who he had refused to recognize as queen, had died in 1821. Since the start of this hike, I've been gradually climbing, which is great because I'm going to have a wonderful view when I get to the top. But you can imagine that it presented a bit of a challenge having a quarry on the top of a hill because you had to get the granite down to the water and to barges. And of course it had to go to barges because granite blocks are so heavy, wagons and roads just wouldn't have been built for the weight. The solution to this problem was to build a railway. So in 1834, a 400-meter tramway was installed to transport granite and ironstone from the hill 60 meters above the water. That steam railway is said to be the oldest industrial railway in all of Atlantic Canada, and a monument to that feat now sits behind the Purcell's Cove Social Club. The stone was so good in this area that there were actually a number of quarries that operated for a long time. I walked past the remains of the Cochran Quarry a little bit earlier. And of course, the Queen's Quarry, and this would be part of it and continues on. And there was the Purcell's Cove Quarry, or the Purcell's Quarry, which was located more towards sea level, right around the base of the hill, more or less where the Purcell's Cove Road is now. Now, if you go online, you'll often see this called as the King's Quarry Trail. It is not. King's Quarry itself was actually close to where Bluestone Road is now because, of course, it was a bluestone and ironstone quarry on the other side of Purcell's Cove Road. You can see the remnants of the quarry here, not just this stone, but if you look closely, there are the drill holes, there are the spots where they would have pried the blocks apart. And this stone was not only used in Halifax, where it was used to build Dalhousie University and St. Mary's Basilica, but it was also exported around the world. For example, in New York City, the Church of St. John the Divine, well, that cathedral is built using stone from here. Well, as I come down past Queen's Quarry, there's this intersection. Now, nobody's exactly sure the route that the tramway used to run. However, photos seem to suggest that this was the junction where that tramway went up to the Queen's Quarry and eventually the Cochran Quarry and went off to other quarries in this direction. And now it ends up being a hiking trail. So this is exactly where it's believed that tramway run. You can tell these are all granite blocks and they've been placed there, absolute certainty. And that is about the width of a tramway, and that would have gone up right next to where the trail is now. And at that Y junction I was at is exactly where it would have split off and gone to the various quarries. Well, I'm surrounded here by granite blocks, and that seems kind of fitting because more or less in this location would have been the Queen's Quarry Wharf, where the tramway would have ended and the granite blocks would have been lifted onto barges to go to Halifax or up and down the eastern seaboard to become the buildings that we admire today. C. Wright Mills once wrote that neither the life of an individual nor the history of a society can be understood without understanding them both. Well, I hope that on your next walkabout, you have the opportunity to experience the stories that are told around you.
Hey, come on, feel the sunshine. Oh, come on, won't you be mine? Hey, come on, feel the sunshine. Oh, come on, won't you be mine? Feel the sunshine. Oh, hey. Oh, hey. Oh, hey. Feel the sunshine. Hey, come on, feel the sunshine.